For more than 2 years, the world has watched the same battlefield, the trenches of eastern Ukraine, the cities of the Donbass, the slow movement of front lines measured in hundreds of meters. Every day, we debate the same questions. How many soldiers has Russia lost? How much territory has Ukraine regained? Can either side break through? But there is a possibility that the world is watching the wrong battlefield, because wars are not always decided where the fighting is most visible. Sometimes they're decided somewhere else, through logistics, through supply chains, through geography, and increasingly, one location appears to be becoming the center of gravity of the entire conflict: Crimea. This peninsula Russia seized in 2014 has always been more than a symbolic prize. It's the foundation of Russia's military presence in the Black Sea. It's home to naval bases, airfields, missile systems, and logistics infrastructure. For Moscow, Crimea represents power projection. For Kiev, Crimea represents the ability of Russia to continue threatening Ukraine long after any ceasefire. And this creates a fundamental strategic problem. Ukraine may not need to capture Crimea tomorrow. It may only need to make Russia realize that holding it is becoming increasingly expensive. And if that happens, the next phase of this war could look very different from the last 2 years. So why does Crimea matter than most people realize? To understand this, we need to go back. Crimea has always been a strategically important piece of geography. It sits at the center of the Black Sea. Via Crimea, Russia can project military power across southern Ukraine, monitor maritime traffic, and threaten commercial shipping routes. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been based in Sevastopol for generations. The location gives Russia something extremely valuable: a forward military position, a base from which it can influence events far beyond the peninsula itself. This is why Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was not simply a territorial acquisition. It changed the strategic balance in the region. For Ukraine, losing Crimea meant losing control over a major part of its maritime security. For Russia, gaining Crimea created a permanent military advantage. But there is another dimension, the economic dimension. Ukraine's future depends heavily on maritime trade, agricultural exports, industrial exports, access to global markets. A country with a threatened coastline faces a permanent economic disadvantage. That means any future peace deal has a fundamental problem. A ceasefire alone does not solve the Crimea issue, because Russia could rebuild its military capacity, and Ukraine would once again face this same strategic vulnerability. This explains why Crimea has become central to Ukraine's long-term thinking. So the battlefield has changed forever. Let's explore this. The Ukraine war has transformed dramatically. In 2022, many expected a traditional military campaign: armored formations, rapid advances, large territorial movements. Instead, the war has evolved into something completely different. This is a war dominated by artillery, then a war dominated by drones. Modern surveillance technology has changed everything. A military unit cannot easily move without being detected. A supply convoy cannot assume it's going to be safe. A concentration of troops becomes a target. This has created a battlefield where offensive operations are extremely difficult, and this explains why Ukraine's strategy appears to have shifted. Rather than attempting to direct assault against heavily fortified Russian positions, Ukraine is increasingly focused on degrading Russia's ability to fight. The logic is simple. If you cannot easily break through the front line, weaken everything behind it. Attack the fuel, attack logistics, the infrastructure, the command systems. Make the enemy weaker before attempting major territorial gains. This is not a new military concept, but drones and long-range weapons have made it far more powerful, and Crimea is particularly vulnerable because it depends heavily on connections outside the peninsula. So the strategy for Ukraine is don't attack Crimea, isolate it. This is perhaps the most important point. Ukraine does not necessarily need to launch a massive invasion of Crimea. That would be one of the most difficult military operations imaginable. Instead, the strategy may be something much more gradual. Make Crimea harder to supply, make it harder to defend, make it more expensive to maintain. Military analysts often talk about shaping operations. So before an army launches a major move, it attempts to create conditions that make success more likely. This can involve destroying logistics, weakening morale, forcing the enemy to spread resources, creating uncertainty. Crimea is particularly sensitive because Russia has limited options. The peninsula is connected to Russia by the Kerch Bridge and a land corridor through southern Ukraine. So there's some maritime routes, there are air links, and each of this becomes potential pressure points. The Kerch Bridge is especially significant. It is both symbolic and strategic. It represents Russian control over Crimea, but it also represents dependence. If that connection becomes unreliable, Russia must rely more heavily on alternative supply routes, and every alternative route creates additional costs, more time, more security, more vulnerability. That is how strategic pressure works, not necessarily through one decisive strike, but through cumulative weaknesses. There is another part of this conflict that receives far less attention, and that is energy, especially oil and gas. The Black Sea is not a military theatre, but it is one of a major energy corridor. Russia remains one of the world's largest oil exporters, and infrastructure connected to the Black Sea plays an important role in those exports. This creates a fascinating overlap. The same geography that matters militarily also matters economically. When Ukraine targets maritime infrastructure, the impact is just not military. Markets pay attention, because energy markets price risk before supply is actually lost. A tanker does not need to be destroyed for oil prices to react. Insurance premiums can rise, shipping routes can change, companies delay voyages. This is why geopolitical events often affect markets before physical disruption occurs. The question for markets is not only how much oil is lost, the question is how much additional risk is being created, and that risk premium moves markets. So Putin has a strategic dilemma. This military challenge is creating a political challenge. This may ultimately be Putin's most difficult problem. Russia has enormous resources, a large population, a powerful industrial base, but wars create pressure over time, more equipment required, more soldiers required, more money required. Eventually, the Kremlin is going to face a difficult choice. Do we escalate? Do we mobilize more young men? Do we accept a longer defensive war? Each choice carries consequences. A new mobilization could strengthen Russia militarily, but politically it creates risk. Many Russians tolerated the war when it was distant. A broader mobilization brings the conflict to ordinary families. That creates domestic pressure. But avoiding mobilization creates another problem. Russia must maintain positions across a massive battlefield while also protecting strategically important areas like Crimea. That creates a dilemma. The more resources Russia commits to one area, the more vulnerable another area becomes. So, could Crimea trigger a nuclear escalation? Because any discussion about Crimea eventually reaches the nuclear question. Would Russia or a cornered Putin use nuclear weapons if Crimea was seriously threatened? Nobody outside the Kremlin knows this answer. But there are a few important factors to consider. Russia previously faced battlefield setbacks without crossing the nuclear threshold. The Kremlin understands that nuclear use would have enormous consequences, internationally, economically, diplomatically. Countries like China and India, who have strong relationships with Russia, but their tolerance for nuclear escalation would likely be far lower. This does not mean escalation risk disappears. It means the decision is more complicated than simply saying, if Crimea is threatened, nuclear weapons will automatically follow. Real strategic decisions are usually more complicated. So, what happens next? There are three possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Russia successfully maintains control. In this scenario, Moscow repairs damaged infrastructure, maintains supply routes, continues defending Crimea. The war becomes a long-term frozen conflict. Scenario 2 is Ukraine increases pressure but does not take Crimea. This may actually be the most realistic intermediate outcome. Crimea becomes increasingly expensive for Russia to maintain. The peninsula remains Russian-controlled, but its military value declines. And scenario 3 is a major strategic shift. Russia faces growing pressure. Mobilization becomes politically difficult. Supply routes become increasingly vulnerable, and Crimea becomes a bargaining issue in any future negotiations. The key point is this. The future of the war may not be decided by who captures the next village. It may be decided by whether Russia can continue sustaining its position. So, what does this all mean? The biggest mistake in analyzing wars is assuming the most visible battlefield is the most important battlefield. History often works in a different manner. The decisive factor is usually what happens behind the front lines, the logistics, the resources, the ability to sustain pressure. Crimea represents all these issues at once. It is a military asset, it is an economic asset, and it is a political symbol. And more increasingly, it's now a strategic vulnerability for Putin. Ukraine does not need to win tomorrow by changing the trajectory of this war. It needs to gradually change the calculation inside the Kremlin. The question is not, can Ukraine capture Crimea? The question is, can Russia continue defending Crimea at an acceptable cost? Because if that answer changes, the entire strategic balance of the war changes with it. And that is why Crimea may become the battlefield that no